The first time he saw her, the sun was dying into the hills and her dress, tattered and gray with dust, was the only thing moving in that silent stretch of plains. Clint Mercer hadn't meant to stop. Lord knows he didn't stop for much of anything anymore. But the way she stood there, alone, unarmed, barefoot, it twisted something deep inside his weather-worn chest that hadn't stirred since the war, since Mary. The wagon sat 10 paces behind her, splintered into ruin. Broken axles, bodies strewn like spilled seed. Birds already circling above. Clint tugged gently at the reins and brought his horse to a halt. He kept his rifle slung but close. Not out of suspicion but instinct. The woman looked up at him then, and her eyes, they weren't the kind of eyes that should have been left to the prairie. They were noble. Not proud. Not scared. But noble in a way Clint hadn't seen in years. She didn't beg. Didn't cry. Just said, "Please?" He dismounted, boots thudding into the dirt, and the weight of the years he carried almost brought him to a knee. "You hurt?" he asked, voice low. Gravelly. She nodded, just barely, and her hand lifted, trembling, to her side. Blood. Not fresh but not dry either. Her lips had cracked under the sun, but she hadn't collapsed. She had fought to stand. That much he respected more than he could say. He helped her to the horse. Didn't ask more questions. Not then. The dead didn't need justice in that moment. They had the quiet. But the living, they needed mercy. And Clint had some of that left in him. They rode slow toward his ranch. The sky turned from fire to ink, and stars blinked down on them like curious ghosts. She didn't say much, but her head rested against his back as the horse trotted along the ridge. Something in that touch, a softness he hadn't felt in years, woke up a man who thought his heart had died with his wife. He didn't even know the woman's name. They reached the cabin just past midnight. Tucked beneath the cottonwoods, far enough from town that folks forgot you were out there. Clint lit a lantern and helped her down. She winced, her knees nearly buckling, but she caught herself before he had to. That strength again. It showed in everything she did, even the way she looked at the walls, at the wooden floorboards like they were gold. "I'll fetch water," he said. She stopped him with a whisper. "Do you have a name?" He turned, surprised. "Clint Mercer." She swallowed, her voice a whisper too soft for the cold air. "I'm Eleanor." That was all she said. He didn't press. By morning, her fever had broken. Clint found her sitting in Mary's old rocker, wearing one of Mary's old dresses. He froze. Not because of the ghost of what once was, but because of how naturally Eleanor fit there. Like she'd always belonged. She smiled when she saw him. Not wide. Not forced. But real. It had been too long since anyone looked at him like that. She told him fragments of what happened. How they'd been part of a small convoy, headed west toward California. How bandits came in the early morning, how fast it all went. They weren't after supplies, she'd said, and her voice trembled for the first time. They knew my name. Clint leaned forward. "Your name?" She nodded. "Eleanor Whitmore. I was born Eleanor Cressfield, daughter of Charles Cressfield. Of Philadelphia." Clint blinked. He hadn't heard that name in years, but when he had, it was in the mouths of men with too much money and too little soul. Railroads. Banking. Land. The Cressfields owned half of everything back east. She looked at him then, her hands folded over her lap. "I was to be married to a man I didn't love. I ran. Took what I could and fled. I thought I could start again." Clint nodded slowly. "And those men were sent to bring you back." Her silence confirmed it. Days passed. She healed. He taught her how to tend the horses, how to split wood, how to keep the coyotes from the chickens. And she, in return, taught him how to speak again. How to laugh at small things. How to let someone close without fearing the hurt. And in the stillness of night, sometimes by the fire, sometimes under the stars, she'd speak of poems she once loved. Of cities lit by gaslight. Of ballrooms and silk and grand expectations she never asked for. He just listened. But even as they built this fragile peace, Clint couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming. That this moment, this sanctuary, was borrowed time. You don't run from men like those and expect them not to follow. And she knew it too. He saw it in the way she locked the doors now. The way she stared just a second too long at the horizon. One evening, weeks later, after a supper of beans and corn fritters, Clint looked at her and said, "You can't hide forever." She didn't flinch. "I don't want to hide." "Then what do you want?" "I want a life that's mine." Clint swallowed. There was something deep in him, old, cracked but not yet broken, that stirred at those words. He stood, reached into the cabinet, and set an old revolver down on the table. "Then you best learn how to use this." They trained under the cottonwoods. At first she trembled at every shot, but soon she steadied. Not perfect, but enough. Enough to give her a chance. They grew close. Not by declarations, not by touch, but in the way their silence became comfortable. In the way they moved around each other, every chore a shared rhythm. The space between them shrank until one night, when the wind howled outside and the fire inside burned low, she reached for his hand. And he didn't pull away. "I never thought I'd feel safe again," she whispered. He met her eyes. "I never thought I'd feel anything again." Then came the knock. It was just after dawn. One knock, then silence. Clint stood, heart pounding. Rifle in hand, he moved to the door and cracked it open. A boy stood there, barely 16. Pale, scared. "They're coming," the boy said. 5 riders. About 2 hours out. Clint didn't ask how he knew. Just nodded, handed him a coin and sent him off. He closed the door slowly. Turned to Eleanor. She already knew. "They'll take me," she said, "and they'll kill you. I ain't planning on dying today. I won't let you. You ain't letting me do anything, Eleanor." His voice was calm but firm. "We made a choice, you and I. And if this is where it ends, then we face it. Together." She stepped toward him, wrapped her arms around his worn frame. "Clint, if we don't make it." He stopped her with a kiss. Not fierce. Not hurried. But long and deep and full of the words neither of them had dared to speak. "I love you," he said against her lips. "I love you," she whispered back. He handed her the revolver. And then they waited. The wind picked up as the sun climbed higher, tugging at the roof shingles and rustling the cottonwoods outside like whispered warnings. Clint sat in his old chair by the window, rifle balanced across his knees, eyes fixed on the trail beyond the ridge. Every second felt heavy. Every breath dragged. But Eleanor stood behind him, calm, her hand resting on his shoulder, her fingers trembling only slightly. "They'll come from the south," Clint murmured. "That rise over there gives them a clean view. If they're smart, they'll split up." Eleanor nodded, clutching the revolver he'd given her. She wasn't just a Baroness now. She was someone else. A woman forged from ashes and fire and love so fierce, it made her eyes gleam with something stronger than fear. He looked up at her, a ghost of a smile tugging at his lips. "You stay low. Things go bad, don't wait. Ride west. The mountains'll hide you." Her voice was steady. "I'm not leaving you, Clint." He didn't argue. Just leaned his forehead to her stomach and closed his eyes for one long breath. Then he rose. The first shot echoed just past noon. A sharp crack that snapped through the air like a whip. It wasn't aimed to kill. A warning. A show of power. Clint watched 3 riders appear over the ridge, one in front, tall and dressed like he owned the land, black hat, duster, and silver buckle that gleamed even in the dust. Another 2 flanked him, lean and sharp-eyed. He knew their kind. Professional. Fast. Deadly. They didn't shout demands. Just rode slowly forward, watching the house. Waiting. Clint stepped onto the porch. Hands empty. Rifle slung but visible. "You boys lost," he called out. The man in the black hat tipped his head. "Not quite. We're here for a lady. Eleanor Cressfield. You might know her by another name." Clint didn't blink. "Ain't no one here by that name." "That's so?" the man said, grinning now. "Well, shame. Mr. Cressfield's offering a handsome reward. We'd hate to disappoint him." Clint stepped off the porch and walked forward 3 slow paces. "This land's mine. Ain't got much, but what I do I protect. If you're looking for trouble, you'll find it." The man's smile faded. "She's coming with us. One way or another." Clint nodded. "I figured you'd say that." A flash from the window. Eleanor fired. The bullet hit the ground inches from the leader's horse, sending the beast rearing. The man yanked the reins, snarling, but Clint was already moving. He dropped, rolled behind the trough, and returned fire. One of the flanking riders cried out and tumbled from his saddle. The other drew fast, but Eleanor's second shot clipped his arm, spinning him sideways in the saddle. Gunfire roared. The porch splintered. Dust clouded the air. But Clint moved with the ease of a man who'd faced worse. He fired, ducked, reloaded. A bullet grazed his shoulder, ripping through his shirt. He hissed but didn't fall. Behind him he heard Eleanor's footsteps, steady, controlled, covering him. When the dust settled, the rider in black was alone. He stood in the center of the yard, hands up, blood on his cheek, fury in his eyes. "This ain't over," he spat. Clint lowered his rifle. "It is for you." But before the man could reply, Eleanor stepped beside Clint, revolver aimed straight at the rider's chest. Her voice was iron. "Tell my father I'm dead. Tell him the woman he tried to own is gone. And if he ever sends another man west, I'll come find him myself. The rider's eyes flicked between them. Then he turned and walked, slowly, back to his horse. He climbed on and rode off without another word. Silence fell again. Clint turned to Eleanor. You all right? She looked down at her shaking hands, at the gun, then back at him. I finally am. They buried the bodies at the edge of the property, marked only by stones. No names, no prayers. Just the wind and the earth and the memory of a choice. That night Clint made stew. Eleanor peeled apples. They didn't talk about the fight. Didn't need to. Instead they talked about spring. About building another room on the cabin. About maybe heading south someday, finding a quiet place near water, maybe starting over where the grass grew tall and the sky never ended. You reckon a Baroness could be happy raising chickens? Clint asked, half a grin on his lips. She leaned against him. I reckon she already is. The days stretched out like golden thread. They rebuilt what had been broken. Slowly. Together. Townsfolk came by now and then asking about the ruckus, the shots, the dust. Clint just said he had wolves. And folks didn't press. Because when a man's eyes looked the way Clint's did now, peaceful, steady, folks learned not to disturb that hard-won quiet. Eleanor wrote letters sometimes. Not to her father. But to no one in particular. She said it helped her remember who she'd been. And how far she'd come. Clint never read them. But he liked the way her hand moved across the page. Like she was drawing a new future, one word at a time. Then one spring morning a letter came. No return. Just sealed in red wax. Clint found her by the creek, toes in the water, humming some tune he didn't know. She read it once. Twice. Then folded it gently and let it float down the stream. He sat beside her, said nothing. She leaned her head against his shoulder. He's dead. My father. Clint wrapped an arm around her. Let the silence speak. I don't feel anything, she said. Not hate. Not grief. Just free. That's all that matters. And it was. Years passed. Seasons turned. And every morning, Clint rose to the smell of coffee and the sound of Eleanor humming in the kitchen. Every night, he held her close, heart steady, soul whole. Sometimes, when the sun dipped low and painted the prairie in firelight, he'd look at her and think, maybe fate doesn't just take. Maybe if you wait long enough, it gives something back. The small wooden chapel at the edge of town had stood empty for years, leaning slightly as if bowed by the weight of prayers that had gone unanswered. But that morning it held something rare in the West, hope. Clint stood at the front, boots polished, coat pressed. A sprig of wild sage tucked behind his ear. His hands fidgeted at his sides, a habit he hadn't shaken since his army days. But his eyes, they were still, steady, locked on the door as if nothing else existed. Then it creaked open. Eleanor stepped in, her dress plain but elegant, soft ivory that caught the morning light and bathed her in something close to holiness. No crowd. No preacher. Just the two of them, and the air between them trembling with everything they'd survived. She walked down that makeshift aisle like it was a path she'd fought 1,000 miles to reach. He took her hand when she reached him, kissed her knuckles and whispered, "You sure about this?" She smiled, the kind of smile that melted away the weight of every loss they'd known. "Only thing I've ever been sure of." They spoke no vows. Didn't need to. Just stood there, hand in hand, the birds chirping outside, the dust motes dancing in the sunbeam like guests too polite to intrude. When Clint slipped a simple silver ring on her finger, something he'd found in town and traded 2 colts and a saddle for, she laughed through tears and kissed him before he could speak. Later they rode out to the ridge. The place where he'd first seen her. Where everything had begun. They sat side by side, legs dangling over the drop, the world stretching endless in every direction. "I used to dream of things like this," she said, voice barely above the wind. "Dreams don't come easy out here," he said. "No. But maybe the hard ones are the ones worth chasing." They sat for hours watching the wind move through the grass. Watching hawks wheel overhead. No plans. No fear. Just time. And each other. But life, as always, doesn't settle easy for long. The telegram came a month later. Addressed to Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore. Clint had seen her face fall the second she read it. A name was all it said. A name from the East. A name she hadn't spoken in months. James K. Harrow. A man once promised to her in marriage. A man her father had trusted. And a man now claiming rightful inheritance to the entire Crestfield fortune. And hunting the woman who'd left him standing at the altar. Clint stood at her side as she read the words again and again, her hands trembling. "Why now?" she whispered. Because he's afraid, Clint said. You're still the rightful heir. If you don't claim it, he gets everything. She stared at the fire. I never wanted that life. You might not want it, but that don't mean you don't deserve it. She looked at him, eyes wide with something that wasn't fear. It was responsibility. The kind that settled heavy on the chest. I'd have to go back, she said. To Philadelphia. Maybe testify. Sign papers. Face him. He nodded. I'll go with you. She laughed, shaky but genuine. You'd hate it there. Don't care, he said. I didn't marry you to stay put. I married you to stand beside you. She kissed him hard, fierce. And in that kiss was every scar, every promise, every soft truth they had yet to speak. So they packed. Not much. Just what they needed. Left the ranch in the hands of a neighbor Clint trusted, young boy named Jesse who reminded him of himself once. As they boarded the eastbound train days later, Eleanor didn't look back. The ride was long. Harsh. And Clint had never felt more out of place. Men in suits. Women in corsets. He sat stiff in the carriage, hat in lap, eyes alert. Eleanor guided him through it gently, with soft touches and quiet words. When they arrived in Philadelphia, it was like stepping into another world. Gas lamps, crowded streets, buildings so tall they seemed to scrape the sky. But the hardest part came in the courtroom. Harrow stood there, tall, proud, polished like silver. His words sweet as honey, his face a mask of charm. But Eleanor stood taller. Not in height, but in spirit. She spoke clearly, with calm, with truth. She didn't plead. Didn't rage. Just laid bare what had been done to her. What her father had planned. What Harrow had agreed to. Clint sat in the back, hat pulled low, watching every man in that room shift in his seat as she spoke. Because the truth, when it's laid out plain by someone who lived it, shakes even the most powerful. The ruling came swift. Eleanor Cressfield Whitmore was declared the rightful heir. Harrow stripped of claim. His face twisted in rage, but he said nothing. Because in that moment, everyone in the room knew, he'd lost not just a fortune, but something far more dangerous. Control. Later, when they left the courthouse hand in hand, reporters shouting questions, Eleanor stopped, turned, and said only, I'm going home. And they did. Back to the ranch. Back to the cottonwoods. Back to the quiet mornings and the wind and the laughter that grew louder with every passing day. With her name cleared and the inheritance officially hers, Eleanor used the money not to rebuild the world she came from, but to build the life she wanted. They expanded the ranch. Brought in a schoolteacher from back east. Set up a clinic in town. Helped the neighbor boys find work, helped widows fix their roofs. And through it all, Clint stayed at her side, steady as the earth beneath her feet. Years passed. The land grew with them. So did their love. And one day, as the sun sank low and the field shimmered gold, Eleanor sat beside Clint on the porch and said, Do you think they'll remember us? He looked at her, brow furrowed. Who? The folks. When we're gone. He smiled. Don't reckon we're the kind you forget. She leaned her head against his shoulder, heart full. Good. I want him to know you saved me. Not from men. Or from death. But from a life I didn't choose. He didn't answer. Just held her hand and kissed her knuckles like he had the day they married. And under that big western sky they sat. Forever. The years had a way of softening things out on the plains. Wind smoothed the edges of fence posts. Rain wore the sharpness off stone. And time worked its quiet magic on even the hardest hearts. Clint and Eleanor had carved a life into the dust and clay of the frontier, one day at a time, like carving initials into bark. Not flashy. Not loud. But deep. Permanent. One summer evening, long after the last cattle had been penned and the sun dipped behind the ridge in a blaze of gold, a rider came fast across the prairie. A young man, not yet 20, dust on his coat and urgency in his eyes. He pulled up outside the Whitmore ranch and called out, Mr. Clint. Mrs. Eleanor. Clint was already stepping off the porch, Eleanor close behind him, apron still dusted with flour from the day's baking. The boy dismounted, catching his breath. It's Sheriff Weller. He's sick. Real bad. They think it's yellow fever. We ain't got no doctor. Folks are scared. Eleanor didn't hesitate. Saddle the horses, Clint. We're going. Clint raised a brow. You sure? She gave him a look that said more than words ever could. Within the hour, they were riding hard toward town. The place had changed. Storefronts stood straighter, paint fresh. The schoolhouse Eleanor helped fund now had 2 teachers and a bell tower. But fear was a language that never changed, and they could see it in the way people stood in clusters, hushed and restless, outside the sheriff's office. Inside, Weller lay burning with fever, skin waxy and pale. Eleanor moved to his side, calm, composed, slipping into the role of caretaker like she'd been born for it. She wiped his brow, took stock of his breathing, and set Clint to boiling water and scrubbing tools like a field medic. "Where's the nearest doctor?" Clint asked one of the deputies. "Last we heard, he's up in Red Bluff. That's 2 days' ride if the river ain't flooded." Clint nodded and stepped out into the street, scanning the horizon. The boy who'd fetched them stood nearby, chewing his lip. "You ride hard?" Clint asked. The boy nodded. "Didn't stop once." Clint laid a hand on his shoulder. "You think you got one more ride in you?" The boy's eyes met his, full of fear, but also pride. "Yes, sir." "Then get to Red Bluff. Take my mare. Fastest thing I've got. Don't stop. Don't sleep. And come back with that doctor." The boy nodded and was off like a shot. Back inside, Eleanor worked through the night. Townsfolk brought clean linens, broth, herbs, anything she asked for. Clint sat by the door, rifle in his lap, watching not for enemies but for despair. Because sometimes that's the thing that takes a town quicker than any fever. As dawn broke, Weller stirred. Fever still high but his breathing steadier. Eleanor hadn't slept. Her hair was tied back, face drawn, hands trembling slightly, but her eyes shone with quiet strength. "You're gonna be all right," she whispered to Weller. "You just hold on. Help's coming." Clint watched her from the doorway, heart tight. He'd seen her ride into a gunfight without blinking, stand in courtrooms where her past was dragged out like laundry on a line. But this fierce, stubborn, gentle woman sitting at a sick man's side, this was where her fire burned brightest. The doctor arrived a day and a half later. Dirty, worn, but quick to act. He took one look at Weller and nodded. "You did right." Another day without care, he'd have slipped away. The town buzzed with relief. And they didn't just thank Eleanor, they saw her. Really saw her. Not as the Baroness who'd once run from the east. Not as Clint's wife. But as a pillar. A woman whose name was now part of the land. That night as they walked back to the ranch, Clint took her hand. "You saved him." "I just did what needed doing." He smiled. "You always do." They rode in silence a while, then Eleanor said quietly, "There's something I've been thinking." "What's that?" She glanced at him. "A child. Maybe it's time." He turned in the saddle, searching her face. "You sure?" "I've never been more." He reached across, touched her cheek. "Then let's build a life that can hold a child." Months passed. Slowly. Gently. Eleanor's belly grew and so did the laughter in the house. Clint built a cradle from pine, every joint smooth, every slat carved with symbols from the prairie, hawks, wildflowers, sunrises. They chose the name before they even knew the child's gender. Hope. But not all stories run smooth. Late one evening, thunder rolled in heavy across the horizon. Eleanor clutched her side, breath catching. Too early. Too sharp. Clint ran for the midwife, but the storm came fast and she arrived breathless and soaked. Hours passed. Pain rose. Fear crept in. Clint paced the floor helpless. The child was born just after midnight. A girl. Tiny. Silent. And then she cried. Strong. Loud. Alive. Eleanor wept, cradling her daughter to her chest as Clint knelt beside the bed, pressing his lips to her forehead. "She's here," Eleanor whispered. "She's real." He nodded, unable to speak. Hope Whitmore grew like a prairie flower, wild, beautiful, resilient. And she had Eleanor's fire, Clint's quiet strength. The ranch echoed with her laughter. Neighbors said they could hear it all the way from the ridge. And when she took her first steps, it was straight into her father's arms. Years later, folks would talk about the Whitmore place as something special. Not just for the cattle or the crops, but because love grew there. Real love. Love built on hard roads, earned through grit and grace. And every so often, a young couple passing through would ask Clint or Eleanor how they made it last. How they kept that fire. Clint would always say the same thing: you start by saving someone. And then you never stop. The final winter came in quiet, slow-moving waves. Not with violence, not with sickness or gunfire, but with time. The kind of winter that doesn't just bite the bones, but whispers to the soul that the years have turned, and the past is closer now than the future. Clint sat on the porch, bundled in his old wool coat, boots resting on the rail. The sky was soft and gray, the kind that made the world feel hushed. Snow clung to the cottonwoods in gentle patches, and the wind carried the faint scent of cedar smoke. Inside, Eleanor was humming. Still humming. She'd always hummed when the world turned heavy. When Clint came back from town bloodied. When the crops failed. when Hope was feverish. And now, even as her hands curled from the ache of years, even as her breath grew thinner in the cold months, she hummed. Hope, now 17, came out with 2 mugs of coffee and sat beside her father. "She's quieter than usual," Hope said. Clint nodded. "She's remembering." Hope studied him, her mother's sharp eyes alive in her young face. "Remembering what?" "Everything. That's what we do when the snow falls. We remember." Hope leaned her head against his shoulder, and they sat there, 2 generations bound by the same roots, watching the world settle under white. That evening, Clint built a fire in the parlor, Eleanor wrapped in her favorite quilt, her silver hair braided down her back. Hope read from one of the books Eleanor had brought west so many years ago, leather-bound, worn soft from use. Clint watched them, something warm and painful swelling in his chest. He could feel it now. The last chapter turning, slow and final. He didn't fear it, not the way younger men do. He'd outridden death more times than he could count. But it's different when you've built something worth staying for. Later, as Eleanor drifted to sleep beside him, her fingers still curled around his, she whispered, "Do you remember that ridge? Where you found me?" He smiled. "I remember every step. I wasn't supposed to survive, Clint. Not the massacre. Not the court. Not the birth. But you made this life possible." He kissed her hand. "You made it beautiful." She didn't answer. She didn't need to. By spring the thaw had come. The snows melted, the river ran full, and the land began to breathe again. Hope planted the garden herself, turning the soil just as her mother had taught her. But the chair on the porch sat empty now. Eleanor passed in her sleep one morning, the quilt pulled up to her chin, her hand resting gently on Clint's arm. Clint didn't cry in front of the town. Didn't make speeches or build monuments. But when he laid her to rest under the cottonwoods, beside the cradle carved from pine now long empty, he knelt for a long time and said words no one else would ever hear. Hope stood beside him, her hand resting on his shoulder. And the strength in her touch told him the story would carry on. The years passed. Clint aged with grace, his back bending slowly, his eyes growing more distant. But he never left the ranch. Couldn't. Every step on that land was a memory. Every sound, wind through the sage, hoofbeats in the distance, was a ghost he didn't fear. Hope took over the ranch. Ran it with her mother's fire and her father's heart. The townsfolk said she had grit like Clint and wisdom like Eleanor. And she carried both their names with pride. One night, Clint walked out to the ridge one last time. The same ridge where he'd found Eleanor, wrapped in blood and silence, all those years ago. The stars were bright. The moon full. He sat on the same stone, breathing deep the air he knew better than his own skin. He pulled a folded piece of paper from his coat. His handwriting was rough but steady. To Hope. Don't let this land harden you. Let it teach you. Let it love you like it loved your mother. Keep the fire burning and never ride away from something worth holding. You are the best of both of us. Pa. The next morning when Hope came up the ridge, she found him there. Still, quiet, peaceful. The letter was in her hand for days after that. She buried him beside Eleanor beneath the cottonwoods. No tombstone. Just a wooden marker carved with a single word, together. The ranch went on. New buildings rose. Children's voices filled the air. Horses ran wild. And every now and then a traveler would come through town, asking about that place on the edge of the prairie. The one folks said had magic in its soil. The one where love lived long and left deep roots. Hope would smile just like her mother once did and say, "It's not magic. It's memory." And when her own daughter asked years later, "What was Grandma Eleanor like?" Hope would look out at the fields and say, "She was the kind of woman who changed everything, just by loving one man the way he needed to be loved." And that, more than anything else, is what stayed. Because some stories aren't made of bullets and blood. Some are carved in love, in sacrifice, in quiet moments that echo across time. And that's the kind that lives forever.